Hey everybody, it's Curse, and today I wanted to share with you my leveling progression for the hardcore SSF Pathfinder that I've gotten up to almost level 95 now. And I want to say we've been fairly safe with this so far. There's a reason we've gotten up to 95. And so I have a leveling guide for you. I have snapshots of my approximate gear, and I'll walk you through what you want to be aiming for. For the end of Act 2, I have a snapshot in Path of Building, as well as at the end of Act 3. I do believe Act 3 is an incredibly important act to get done right because it's one of the most dangerous ones. And then I have end of Act 6, as well as level 90, which is probably after you finished tier 15 maps, and then level 95 after you make your CI switch. So I'll walk you through that entire leveling progression. And of course, I'll have a link to the Path of Building in the description below. So check that out. Just keep in mind that this is my very first Path of Building build guide. So if there are any errors, just let me know and I'll try to correct them. But I do anticipate it's not going to be as polished as I'd like it to be. Anyways, let's jump right in. いらっしゃいませ. All right, so this is the Path of Building that I have here. You can see at the very top, we have end of Act 2 skill tree, passive skill tree, and then skill setup, and then item setup. So all of them change when you switch around between end of Act 2, then end of Act 3. This is the item setup that I had at the time. And then I'll go into more detail as to why I made some of the item and skill tree choices. And then we have end of Act 6, level 90. And then after we made the CI switch around level 92, I made it. So I have a level 95 setup, which is essentially what I'm running right now. I've also captured my HP and energy shield at different points in time. So this is end of Act 1, end of Act 2, end of Act 3, etc., etc. So different snapshots of my progression. And I hope some of these will help you understand, I guess, how the flow of the build works. So based on this, I want to highlight, for example, as you're going through the campaign, you want to rely much more on HP than on energy shield. Pathfinder is Ranger, and so the Ranger starting point doesn't have access to as much energy shield passive nodes as something like a Witch, for example, which is why we just rely on HP stacking, and you want to stack a lot of it. In Act 3, you want to have over 1000 HP, especially if you're going to be fighting the monkey. Monkey easily one-shots something like 800-900 in a single hit. So make sure you're ready before you run into the monkey. Otherwise, I think we've all seen those clips of POE2 streamers getting one-shot by that monkey. That's one of the trickiest and nastiest one-shots in the game. Another one to be careful of is the Viper. So stacking HP helps there as well. There's a lot of damage over time, chaos damage in particular, that you want to watch out for. So stack HP, I'll show you some sample items once we go back to the POB. Make sure to have resistance rings for specific boss fights. I made a huge mistake with the Fire Witch fight in Act 3. Not only did I not prepare enough fire resistances, I didn't even pick up, there's a little ritual, mini ritual that you can do on the map that gives you a fire resistance buff as well. So I did neither of those. I ran into that fight with -10 fire res, and I nearly got one shot. So don't do that. Make sure to just have some fire res ring in your stash and just swap them in and do the fight afterwards. And as you can see, we start picking up more and more energy shield as we progress through the campaign. And especially when we get to maps, our HP is basically capped out. It's very difficult to get HP beyond 2000 without perfect gear and without tons and tons of strength investment. It's much easier to start stacking energy shield passive nodes on the skill tree, as well as energy shield items. Towards the end game, you can get incredibly high energy shield values on your items. Take advantage of that. And we also knew that we were planning on a CI respec eventually. So getting that energy shield stacking early seemed like the right choice. Then by level 92, you can see energy shield is majority of our survivability. And even after the CI respec, we're just as tanky as before against one-shots, and even more so once you factor in Grim Feast. So this is the one-shot tankiness progression. And I want to highlight one more time, the greatest risk for most hardcore SSF characters to die throughout the campaign and even afterwards is one-shots, especially if you have high evasion. Evasion mitigates a lot of the small hits, but most boss one-shots are non-evadable. So you got to bring up your one-shot tankiness to be as high as possible. I would also say I like to stack HP more so than resistances during the campaign. HP stacking mitigates both phys damage one-shots, but also elemental damage one-shots. And given that one-shots is the greatest threat to us, and given the lack of availability for just various elemental resistances, it's not easy to stack elemental res, especially in the first 3 acts. Once you get to act 4, 5, and 6, you can definitely start maxing out your resistances, or at least getting them to be over 50%. But in the first 3 acts, I would more focus on stacking as much HP as possible, saving rings with various elemental implicits to switch in for particular boss fights. So make sure you know the damage type of every boss that you're fighting against. So with that kind of preparation, you can get away with just pure HP and a little bit of energy shield stacking. And again, the primary objective there is to mitigate one-shots. And so back to the POB, in terms of passive skills, there's not much we can do for defensive layers here. So we're going for pure damage in the first 2 acts. You can see these are all damage nodes. Then we go for these extra damage nodes, skill speed, and even more damage. This is 74% if you have a Herald of Ice active, which is at all times. Then as we progress through Act 3, we pick up our Shattering Concoction is definitely the first thing we pick up in Act 2, but then we also get more flask charges gained in Act 3. So we start being able to sustain Shattering Concoction better. Keep in mind, you're still going to need to have alternatives. So if you go to the skills here, go back to Act 2. End of Act 2, we will have Shattering Concoction, but you cannot spam it against boss fights. You can probably get away with it using it for clear most of the time. Basically 95% of the time. You're not going to run out of mana pots. But against bosses, you need a secondary source of damage. In our case, we're using Lightning Rod and Orb of Storms. And we will continue using these two well into Act 3, definitely all of Act 3, even Act 3 boss. And I don't know, maybe towards Act 6, even we still have it just as a fallback. I found that Alchemist's Boon made a big difference for me in terms of Shattering Concoction sustain in boss fights. So plan for running Orb of Storms and Lightning Rod in boss fights for as long as you need, and then alternating between Shattering Concoction and these two during the boss fight until you reach that critical mass. And even at level 95, by the way, I still run out of mana pots in some prolonged boss fights, and I have to just run around in circles and wait for those mana pots to come back. But this is the reason, the combo between Lightning Rod and Shattering Concoction is the reason that by end of Act 3, I was actually running Rising Tempest. By the end of Act 6, I switched Rising Tempest for Magnified Effect and Mobility. At this point, you probably don't need the Lightning Rod, maybe just one-offs here and there where you run out of mana pots. So back to the skill tree. Act 3, you want to address some attributes, shortcomings that you might have. And just keep in mind, the way that I've set up the attributes here, just ignore it. And basically what you want to be doing is keeping your dexterity and intelligence as low as possible and spamming as much strength as you can get away with. And being dynamic with that refund passives button, so that whenever you're like 5 dex short or 5 inch short, just switch some strength to that. But always keep your strength as high as possible, because strength is HP, strength is survivability, whereas dexterity and int don't give you any survivability. We also get Subterfuge Mask. This is a phenomenal passive, especially in the end game. This on its own just gives you so much. Make sure to pick it up. We also pick up some unarmed damage and unarmed AoE. Very high value 4 points right here. I even pick up this small 15% area node as well. I think this is definitely worth it. And like I said, by the end of Act 3, we rely on Shattering Concoction more and more. So we want to get some points of increased flask charges gained. So that's why we're picking up these 6 in particular. And then over here, very good movement speed, a bit of dexterity evasion. We can progress to end of Act 6, where we've started to pick up crit. So yeah, between Act 4, 5, and 6, you can start switching into crit. And the point that I would recommend doing that is when you unlock Eye of Winter. So before you have Eye of Winter, don't bother with crit. Or maybe just right before you unlock it, you can start investing a little bit. But yeah, once you pick up Eye of Winter, you want to start picking up as much crit as possible. And by the way, I'm spotting a little mistake here. You want to pick up this over this node. Yeah, this is an extra 5% critical hit chance. So there we go. That's a little correction there. But yeah, pick up crit. Get a little bit of extra attack speed and evasion. That is before you get your Eye of Winter. This is probably Act 4, what you want to be investing in. And then as you progress upwards towards even more crit, you can get a bit of extra survivability. Because as you'll notice, so far we haven't really invested in survivability on this passive tree. The only survivability maybe is over here, and then way, way, way late into Act 6 up here. This evasion here, sure, we can count it, but really evasion doesn't protect against one-shots. It's not as valuable. That is a sustain against lots of mobs. And then by level 90, you want to pick up the rest of the crit, some very high value utility nodes here for cold damage and for freeze. A lot of energy shield. These are temporary as we start making our way for extra energy shield for the CI swap. Once you swap to Widowhail, you want to invest into Quiver effect as well, but not before. I find these nodes to be much more valuable once you get a +2 proj Quiver. So that's the progression, and then into CI, you can see we get the energy shield, we get the freeze protection, and I've even outlined the weapon swaps that I would recommend. So you can see the red stuff is your main hand, and then the green stuff is your offhand, which is a staff. And we're reworking some of the nodes here for just more optimal pathing, but not really too many differences when it comes to the CI swap. We just need to be able to mitigate stun as well as freeze, and then have a bit of extra energy shield nodes, which you can't really easily access. We just have these ones here and these ones here, but you need quite a few levels to get the energy shield that we need to switch to CI, is what I found. Not only that, but we're also picking +6 passive points from our 4th ascendancy. The 3rd one I would recommend is Running Assault, and then the 4th one is Traveler's Wisdom. So that's kind of the skill progression that I went through. And obviously we get CI together with Eternal Youth, so that's a bit of a no-brainer. We switch to CI at level 92. So you have to be extremely careful before you get to that CI switch. I would recommend not engaging with too many of the endgame activities like Breach, Ritual. First of all, Breach doesn't even give you splinters before maybe tier 11 maps. I can't remember exactly, but don't even bother with it. I would just skip it until you have CI. Ritual, same thing. Way too much chaos damage. I ran 0% chaos res until level 92 when we switched to CI. And somehow we never felt threatened by chaos damage. I was just extremely careful with the kind of fights that I picked. Just in general, be aware of the enemies that you're fighting. Anybody that deals chaos damage, be extremely, extremely cautious around them and avoid staying in those chaos damage poison pools. And you can certainly make it to level 92 with 0% chaos res. We've done it. But if you feel more comfortable, you can try getting 20, 30, 50 maybe chaos res just for that leveling progression. So let's talk about some of the itemization progression. You can see that I don't have Widowhail too early on. I would recommend holding off switching to Widowhail until you have a +2 proj Quiver. So you need item level 41 in order for Quivers to even have +2 proj available to spawn. And so that doesn't happen until Act 3. So once you're in Act 3 and you start killing monster level, let's say 42, 43, maybe even 40, you can start checking the item level on the Quivers that drop. And I would recommend anything over 41, you just pick it up and you craft it. And you pray to RNGesus that you get +2 proj. And I want to expand a little bit on what I meant by craft up the quiver. What I mean by that is just using an orb of transmutation on every single white quiver that drops. That's like item level 41 plus. So this one, if you hold out, it gives you the item level if you didn't know. And then orb of augmentation as well. So double orb, keep the item blue, unless it's one of these two quiver implicit types. So the increased attack speed, which I don't know if they drop too early anyways, or the visceral quiver, which is critical hit chance. So these two types of quiver are the only ones I would consider regaling up to rare. And then regardless of whether the quiver is the right subtype or it's blue or yellow like magic or rare, you always reroll them until you get that +2 proj. Gamba every single quiver that you get and reroll every single quiver until you get that +2 proj. It's just so important that I found it to be worth it. And just banking on a primed quiver, waiting for that perfect quiver, it's never going to happen. You can see I'm still using a toxic quiver. Would I love for that toxic quiver to actually be a primed quiver? Sure, of course. But the suffixes on this toxic quiver are just too good to ignore, and I would take it over a lot of other primed quivers. That was my crafting strategy in the campaign. Just all in on +2 proj quivers, as well as plus 0.25 potions per second mana pods. So those are the two most important items to craft around. And as a quick note, you get the 0.25 charges per second suffix on the mana flasks starting at item level 45. So that is again in Act 3 normal. So as soon as you start getting mana flasks that are 45 plus, I would recommend doing the same crafting strategy as we utilize for the quivers. Rerolling them with the reforge option, and then using your augments, etc. to get them to possibly spawn this. And once you get a +2 proj quiver, you really want to switch into a Widowhail, because the Widowhail is going to give you that much more. The best thing about Shattering Concoction is that it doesn't cost any mana. It just costs flask charges, 3 at all times. So you can get as high of a level as you can, and it's not going to make a difference whatsoever when it comes to mana cost. And for an endgame quiver, once you get the +2 proj, I would also prioritize things like crit hit, crit damage, dex. Those are all great suffixes. Attack speed is another great suffix. And then proj speed on the prefixes. I find the concoctions to be a little bit slow on the flight speed. So even just a little bit of proj speed on the prefixes can make a big difference. And then obviously just flat damage on the prefixes. And in order to get through the first 2 acts, some of the best sources of damage are runes. You can see here in this Act 2 bow that I have set up, we get +6 to 10 cold damage per rune. That is a very decent chunk of the entire damage pool that we have, even for this fairly well-rolled bow. So make sure to take advantage of runes early on, especially in Act 1. As soon as you drop runes, throw them into your bow if you can afford the socket jewels, or if you happen to find a bow with sockets, just utilize them early because they make a massive difference. And then once you start needing that Widowhail, so the best way to farm that is twofold. One is by killing Beira, the very first witch that you encounter into the second zone in Act 1. You can just create a brand new character and then kill her over and over and over. I've killed her hundreds of times, and I've actually dropped 3 Widowhails from her. I'm pretty sure that's on the lucky side. I don't think I should have dropped that many. So that's 3 Widowhails from her. The second source is going to be gambling on a level 2 character. So just fresh off of the first zone, get into the town and gamble away. You can gamble up to 100 bows. And then you have to kill 100 beaters afterwards in order to refresh that 100 ball gambling pool. But just to give you an idea, I gambled about 400 bows and got 3 Widowhails from that. So it's a pretty good chance to get a Widowhail from that. My very first Widowhail was actually a 150% one. So I had to farm another one because, you know, I got the mineral. But in general, farming bows that way, each bow is 350 gold, so 100 of them is 35k. So, you know, 400 bows, it's nothing. By the end game, 120k gold, or actually let's say 140k gold, is a joke. That's not anything you need to worry about. So this is a very efficient way to farm the Widowhails. It just takes time. The time to gamble those balls and then to refresh that 100 bow pool by killing Beira 100 times. And so you can rinse and repeat that. Another way to get Widowhails is by using chance orbs on, again, crude bows. So that can be your starter bow even. And out of 2 chance orbs, I got 1 Widowhail, but I think, again, I got lucky there. Probably something like 1 in 10, if I remember correctly. It's maybe 10% or 15%. It's something like that. There is a website online that you can look it up and see the exact probabilities of chance orbs to give you certain items. But this third option with chance orbs is not very reliable because you don't get very many chance orbs early on in the game. If your main character is, let's say, Act 3 or maybe Act 4 in the campaign, you're not going to have that many chance orbs. So I would rely on just the first 2 options, Gamba plus Beira, just rinse and repeat, and get as many Widowhails as you need until I would recommend aiming for at least 235% Quiver effectiveness. Because once you have 235, between that plus these 4 nodes, you're at 300% Quiver effectiveness. If you have 220 plus, you have to pick this one up as well, and that's okay. So 220 is all right, but ideally you want 235 and above. And if you happen to get lucky and you get a 250, you can even consider dropping this one. Or I guess if you Vow Orb and get lucky and you get over 250, that's next level. Ideally, if you get insanely lucky or just farm Widowhails for days, 270 Quiver effectiveness allows you to get to that 350 threshold, which is plus 7 additional proj skills. So that's pretty substantial just from the Quiver effectiveness itself. But I've vowed like 10 Widowhails and I haven't hit anything over 250. I'm still running at 235 Widowhail. And I wanted to mention some super high value uniques for leveling. The first one is Enfolding Dawn. You can see I've used it in the Act 3 setup here. It's one of the best leveling chest pieces in the game. 15% to all res if you happen to be lucky. 100 to spirit. You can invest that in skeletons, which can just distract enemies as you're running around. It's also super nice that it drops from Beira in Act 1. So during your Beira runs, you might get lucky and drop one of these. That's how I got mine. And I used it well into Act 4 or 5, I can't remember, maybe even Act 6 is when I switched into a rare chest piece. But certainly most of the campaign I was running this chest. Another really good item to utilize for leveling is Adziri's Disdain Gold Circlet. So this one, as you know, it gives you a bunch of energy shield as a function of your max life. And that energy shield gets scaled by your percent increased energy shield bonuses on your passive tree. So it's just ridiculous amounts of energy shield. The downside is that 25% of damage taken bypasses energy shield. And honestly, sometimes that's not even a downside. You can turn that to an upside with Pathfinder because our potions are super strong. They recover tons of HP. It's a little bit, I would say, too awkward to pick up Eternal Youth too early. So during mapping, for example, this is a very good way to make use of your potions and to generate a bit of sustain while min-maxing your survivability to one-shots as well. It's one of the best items, I would say, to utilize during the mapping leveling process. Of course, eventually we're going for CI, and in CI there's no room for Adziri's Disdain. But before you get CI, I would recommend using this one if you've been lucky enough to drop one of them. And when it comes to the end game, 99, maybe 100% of builds that are min-max utilize ingenuity, even more so on softcore trade because you can get that much more out of your rings. And as you saw at the beginning of this video, we got 78% corrupted ingenuity belt, pretty solid. So I do end up utilizing it in my 95 CI setup. It is an improvement over my previous belt, even though the previous belt is pretty solid. Then there's Hands of Wisdom in action. These gloves are absolutely ridiculous as well. They're utilized in every single attribute stacking build. we have 350 dex, 190 int, and I tested out what happens when we switch from our existing gloves to HOA. And I mean, I don't have HOA in my current build yet, but just for testing purposes, you can see the damage goes up from 19.2 to 19.9. So surprisingly, it's not as big of a damage increase as I thought it would be. Perhaps my current gloves are pretty solid, 15 attack speed, 24 dex, 38 fire. I mean, I guess it's mostly the 15 attack speed, what we're getting out of these. They're also better defensively, the rare gloves. HOA should be the hands down superior offensive glove once you stack a bit more int. Especially when you factor in the higher likelihood of shocking the enemy. 20% more damage is massive. I might swap into HOA later on if I can mitigate some of the downsides from losing my gloves. But I definitely wanted to mention it as an aspirational item to aim towards as you optimize your dex and int stacking. And it's also one of my next objectives is to pick up a HOA. Even if we don't use it, it's a nice trophy to have and to put it in the stash on a hardcore SSF character. And during the process of making this video, I actually ended up getting an upgrade to my amulet. Check this one out. It gave us, I want to say between 13, maybe 15% more energy shield because of the 2 energy shield prefixes. We lost the plus spirit, so that means we lost the extra evasion from Wind Dancer, but that wasn't a big deal because the amulet also has tier 5 evasion. It even has +1 proj. If only that was +3 proj, this would have been a god tier amulet. But even as it is, critical hit chance is amazing for the build, plus proj, double energy shield. This is just an insane amulet. So I plugged this one into the POB as well in my 95 CI setup. And you can see I'm now up to 7.7k energy shield. So once we max out Grimfist, it's like 15.5k ES. It's absolutely ridiculous the amount of tackiness that we have. I feel very comfortable in soon tackling things like Breachstone. You can see we're pretty close to it. And then we'll keep pushing the character and see what level we can get. I'm probably going to get bored around 96, 97. We'll see. But I'm hoping to at least get 96. And that's it for the guide. I'll leave you with a monster level 82 Sun Temple map run in the background. That's the highest possible monster level map you can get. And it gives you a pretty good idea of how efficient the build is at clear. Most monsters die in 1 or 2 throws of the Shattering Concoction. And the movement speed is decent. Considering we're running hardcore SSF, I'm not trying to get ahead of myself and just blink into monsters. I'm not taking any risks like that. So the clear speed is not as good as a softcore character. But we're level 95, top 300 in hardcore SSF in the entire world. And we're going to keep going. In terms of next steps here, I'm going to probably hit at least level 96. I also kind of want to just beat Breachstone, just to have one more accomplishment for this character. I'm considering whether or not I want to fight the Uber boss, the Arbiter of Ash. His one-shot's just so nasty. I'm kind of thinking I might skip that one. But we'll see. Maybe right before I get bored of the game, I try one Arbiter of Ash fight. But whatever happens, what we're setting our sights on next is Last Epoch 1.2. It's coming out on April 2nd. So I want to start playing the game at least 1 or 2 weeks ahead of time to remind myself what the game looks like, think about what character I want to play. I'm probably not going to decide until I see patch notes, but I can still practice a little bit of campaign runs and just bring back that muscle memory of Last Epoch. If you're a Path of Exile 2 fan and you have never tried Last Epoch, I strongly recommend it. We have a very good community in Last Epoch, and I share my build guides every season, so certainly check it out if you haven't already. And if you want to check out our progress on this Path of Exile 2 hardcore SSF run, you can always find me on Twitch. I stream 3 to 4 nights a week, unless there's a major event like a patch dropping for POE or Last Epoch. Then I take some time off work and I try to stream full days for 2, 3, 4, maybe even more days straight. And that's what we're going to be doing April 2nd, for example. But yeah, check me out on Twitch. Like and subscribe the video if you enjoyed it, if you found it useful, if you might utilize some of the concepts here in your hardcore SSF Pathfinder run. And either way, Much love, everybody. Thank you so much. Take it easy and gochiso samarasha.